What's going on, guys? Bryce here again, and this is a continuation of my full stack React app tutorial. I had a suggestion in a YouTube comment to include some best practices in this app since I didn't entirely show how some of those are done. My thinking in that was just that, this was intended to be a simple tutorial just to get you off the ground essentially. But I thought it'd be an interesting bonus and follow-up to the tutorial. So I'd like to get started with just something easy, fixing up our README file. So as this is a open source project, since we included it in GitHub, we should probably have some useful documentation or just something of a description that's meaningful for our project. So I left this this README file was generated automatically when we set up the repo the first time. So let's just change some of the text here and make it a little bit more useful. So for the main heading of our app, let's just change it to weather app, since this was the name of the project. And we'll just type out a quick description for it. So maybe something like a simple weather app built following along a YouTube tutorial using React, Express, and PostgreSQL. Perfect. Now if we look under our client folder, we'll have another README that's actually generated in there as well. So the content of this README that's here now was actually generated when we ran our create React app package right when we started developing our front end. So this is just the default information. It has information for developers just about deploying and editing your React app and working with different aspects of the project. So we'll just do Control A to select all. We'll just clear that out. And we'll give just a simpler description of what's going on here. So we could call it weather app React front end. And we can just give a short description, possibly something like a simple interface for viewing weather data that is received from a free weather API. Great. So just to reiterate, is this something that's required, these changes to the README files? No, but just because our project is public, it's just a good practice to give something kind of descriptive about what's going on. And as the app became more complex, if we wanted to share other information such as links to resources, information about licensing and collaboration, different open source aspects like that, the README files are a great place to do that. So moving on, we can close these README files. And now we're going to go through and clean up certain aspects of our code. And this applies to both the server and the client side. So if we open up our index.js file here, for example, you might have noticed throughout I'm using this different notation for doing callback functions. And we can see that it involves kind of having your parameters in brackets and then an arrow followed by some curly brackets, which represents our function body. So really, this is called the ES6 or ECMAScript 6 syntax for arrow functions. And it's pretty common to use these now in when you're performing JavaScript callbacks. And not only are they just a cleaner, shorter way of writing functions, but actually in circumstances like classes, they don't have an existence of its own this keyword. So if you were to write a method within a class to manipulate some variable that was set inside the constructor, then you could just reference those variables using the this keyword that you're familiar with in JavaScript and not having to worry about the scope this object that's within the that would typically be inside of a function in traditional JavaScript. So what we'll do now is just go through our files and just change any of the circumstances where we're using the traditional function keyword way of writing callbacks. So in our weather.js file that I opened here, we can see that we have some examples right here to take care of. So if we go to the then method, it's passed a callback function. So we're going to remove that function keyword and then just add a arrow, which is just a equals and then greater than sign. And repeat the same thing here for the catch method. Perfect. Save that. So moving on, I'm going to open the cities file. And we have another example here where we used function. So I'll get rid of that keyword, replace with an arrow. Do the same thing down here. Put in our arrow, save, close these files. Moving on to our database class, I believe, this file we used arrow functions in this file. The weather.js file in our API folder. Okay, another couple examples here. So get rid of function, add in the arrow, get rid of function, add in the arrow. In our cities API folder file, gonna get rid of that function keyword, add the arrow, get rid of function, add the arrow, and repeat the same thing down here a couple of times. Perfect. So that takes care of the files in our server side. Now if I just go under our client side real quick, go into our source files here. We have 3 different classes here. So in our app.js file, I used arrow functions all along the way here. That's definitely something you want to do in React. Again, so to explain, I mentioned this keyword here. So typically functions in traditional JavaScript, the this that they reference is according to the scope of the function that you're in. So if this was using a function keyword, using the function keyword, the traditional way of writing JavaScript functions, we would not have access to this get city list method that's defined in our class, because the this that would be in this scope would mean something entirely different than the this that represents the class that we're currently in. So that's very helpful, and it's also something that probably you're more familiar with if you've ever done any kind of object-oriented programming, such as like in Java or C#. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. I'm just going to check these couple of other files as well. Nothing there. And in weather.js, nothing here either, using arrow functions. Great. So I'm just going to close these files that we were editing. And I just wanted to mention, if you want to read more about arrow functions, if that's something that's kind of confusing as a concept, it's kind of tough to grasp at first, I'll include a link in the description to some online documentation that talks about ES6 arrow functions. So lastly, an improvement we're going to make is we're going to create something called a .env, so it's like an environment file. So to do this, we're going to start by installing a package. So npm install .dot.env, E-N-V, and we'll do --save. So what this library helps us do is essentially store environment variables in a place that is secure, and we won't include them in our GitHub repo. So if we open up our git ignore file, you can see that one of the files down here is actually .env. So when we create this file, it won't be included in the files that get synced to our repo, so they won't show up there. And what that means is the contents of those of that file are not shared with anyone. So that's a good place where we can store usernames, passwords, and in our case, it'll be the API key to our weather API. So that package is done installing, so let's just clear our terminal. We'll close this git ignore file. And then in the root of our project, we're going to create a new file, and it's just going to be called .env, just as you would expect. So in this file, all we're going to do, all you specify on each line are like key value pairs of environment variables. So we'll make one called weather API underscore API underscore key, and we'll put an equal sign. And then we're going to open up our weather model under the models folder, and we're going to actually copy that key that we hard coded into the file. We're going to cut and paste that into our .env file and save. So we can close this folder, or sorry, this file, and then return to our weather.js file. And now we just need to call the .env library just so we can have access to those environment variables that we set up in that file. So if we do require .env and then .config, this is going to initialize those variables. We can now get rid of this const API, this API key constant, and then in the part of our string of our URL where we're actually fetching that data, we can just change this directly to process.env .weather in capitals underscore API underscore key, which is the name of that variable that we set up in our .env file. And we'll save that. So we've made some changes to the files for our app, and in order for those changes to be reflected in Heroku, we're also going to have to redeploy our app. But before we do that, we're going to need to use this environment variable for our weather API key on Heroku, since it manages the environment variables differently than in like a static file like we do on our development environment here using the .env library. So what you're going to want to do is go back into our .env file, and we're going to copy this API key again. And if we just minimize this, so you're going to want to log into your Heroku dashboard. So if you go to dashboard.heroku.com and enter your login information, you're going to want to find your the deployed app that we created. So for mine, it's right here, weather-app.bsp-2018. And if you go under settings in the dashboard and you reveal the config vars, you can actually set the config variables here as well. So we're going to create one called weather underscore API underscore key, all in caps, to match our code. And then we're going to add the value of our API key, paste it into this box, and click add. Perfect. So we have that done. So we can minimize this and return to our Visual Studio Code, and we'll close this file and close this one too. And we're going to commit our changes first of all to our GitHub repo. So for our message, we're just going to say added changes to reflect best practices, and hit the little check mark to commit. Perfect. And then git push to push to our remote repo. Perfect. And now we're going to need to log into our Heroku CLI again so we can redeploy our app. So if we run the command Heroku login, it's going to recognize my email. So I just press enter, and then I enter my password, as will you. And we're logged in successfully. So now we're going to run, as before, git push Heroku master. And it's going to build our sources and redeploy our app with the current changes. So we'll just wait for that to finish. Perfect. So our build succeeded. And then we're just going to enter the command Heroku ps scale :scale web equals 1 just to make sure it's running on our dynos. Perfect. And now we can open with Heroku open just to see the changes in action and make sure everything still works as it should. So if I just bring this window here, here's our app running. And if I select a city, let's say Montreal, we can see that we fetched our weather. So we didn't really change the functionality of our app, but we just cleaned up the code, followed some best practices, and also separated credentials from the source code not being hard-coded and placed into an appropriate environment variable. Great, so you learned a few more best practices. Again, I just want to reiterate that this is a simple app. If you want to continue learning about web apps and working with React and these various technologies, I just recommend that you practice, continue building, continue reading about how to follow proper design patterns and improve the way that you develop these applications. And if you've enjoyed this tutorial, please subscribe or recommend it to a friend. And thanks for watching.